Chapter 6. Small Spaces, Katherine Arden. Cass wandered in, or sprinted in, just as the bell rang, to find the promised donuts nestled in a white box at the front of the room. Mr. Easton knew the value of food bribes, especially on a cold, wet farm day. Ollie took a plain cake donut. She would save her chocolate chip muffin for later. Munching, she stowed her stuff and pulled out Small Spaces. She'd just read for a minute. The next day, Caleb came back. He was pale and blue-lipped. His eyes were strange and distant. I remember thinking with a shiver that a drowned man breathed back to life would look like him. But it was really him. It was his voice, his smile. Only the look in his eyes had changed, and he would not say where he had been. "I don't remember," he said. The town decided that he must have hit his head and wandered for days insensible. I made myself believe it too. I have never seen anyone so glad as Kathy when her 2 sons came back to her. She cried with joy and didn't even notice the look in Caleb's eyes. The next pages dealt with Beth's wedding, the honeymoon. Ollie began to skim. She wanted to know the end. She wanted to know what had happened with the smiling man. She caught snatches along the way. Caleb was best man at the wedding, standing silent at his brother's side. Kathy cried again when we said our vows. She loved her sons very much. We were a month in France after the wedding, and I did not think the Mediterranean was as beautiful as Smoke Hollow in the spring. The night you were born, it snowed in May. I have never loved anyone so much as I loved my Jonathan, except for you, dearest daughter. There was so much joy, so much peace in our house, until one night. Ollie began reading properly again. It was autumn. There had been cold rain all the day, and the mist was rising in the corn. It was just after the harvest, and the stalks rustled, gray and dead. Jonathan had been out late. In the barn, I thought. One of the cows was calving out of season. Jonathan came in, wet, his hair plastered down. He didn't smell like the barn, not at all. His eyes were white-rimmed, wild. He came back. "Beth, my girl," he said, sank into a chair near the wood stove and buried his face in his hands. The smiling man came back. "I said," Mr. Easton's voice broke in, "what is the significance of Misty Valley Farm, Ollie?" Ollie looked up, a little wild-eyed herself. Oh, right. Class must have started, and she hadn't noticed. Well, it wasn't the first time. Ollie's shoulders stiffened. She took a bite of donut and said, without missing a beat, "Misty Valley Farm is the best example in the state of Vermont of the possibilities achievable in small-scale farming." Giggles swept the room. She was imitating Mr. Easton in lecture mode. Ollie thought she heard Mr. Easton sigh. "The farm has had tremendous success cultivating corn and wheat along with apple, plum, and pear orchards," Ollie continued. "They also run an extensive dairy operation and side businesses in local florals and sugaring. During harvest time, they are one of the biggest employers in the county." Ollie remembered nearly everything she read, a vital talent for any girl who reads novels in class and doesn't pay attention. Having neatly recited the introduction to Misty Valley from its website, Ollie tried to find her place again in her book. Without looking up, she could feel the words trembling on Mr. Easton's tongue. "What is that you're reading, Ollie? Now is not the time for novels. Put it away." But sympathy face again. Also, Ollie had answered his question. When Coco Zintner's hand shot into the air, Mr. Easton only said mildly, "That is correct, Ollie," and turned to Coco. Ollie wished she hadn't made fun of him. "Do you have something to add, Miss Zintner?" Coco evidently did. She was half out of her seat, waving her hand. You had to hand it to Coco. Anyone else would have crept into class, head down, hoping the notebook incident had been forgotten. Not Coco Zintner. Said Coco, the words tumbling out. "I just have a question. What about the ghosts?" A faint murmur of interest ran through the room. "My mom told me about them," Coco added smugly. Coco's mom was a reporter for the Evansburg Independent. She had come to talk to their class once, casual in her jeans, with a thick ash-colored ponytail. She made Mr. Easton go giggly. Can you please tell us? Mr. Easton looked torn. I wouldn't say there are ghosts, he said. Not exactly. But there are certainly some sad episodes in Misty Valley's past. Sad episodes were more interesting than agriculture. Tell us, said Phil Greenblatt, and the rest of the class took up the cry. Coco looked proud of herself. Mr. Easton hesitated. He probably liked talking about ghosts, too. Well, Misty Valley has been a farm for a while, said Mr. Easton, giving in. Or at least people have been farming that land a long time. Back in the 1800s, it was called, foggy, smoky something. I forget now. It gets foggy after dark because of the humidity off the river. That's why it's called Misty Valley now. Ollie thought of the smiling man coming out of the smoky dark. There were 2 brothers who worked in the fields, said Mr. Easton. They used to go about with the owner's daughter. The girl wasn't even 18 when her father died, and she became the owner herself. Both boys were in love with her, and there was a lot of talk in Evansburg. Folk wondering which brother she would marry. 50 acres isn't anything to sneeze at. Ollie frowned and glanced at her book. She married the older brother in the end. If his younger brother was jealous, there's no record of it. They all lived on the farm. The married couple had at least 1 kid, a girl. The girl grew up, got married herself, moved away. All normal, right? There were probably lots of brothers trying to marry the same girl in the 19th century, Ollie thought. But she looked at her book again. The whole class shifted in their seats. Long-dead romances were not as interesting as ghosts. But one night, the older brother disappeared, Mr. Easton continued. Just gone. Vanished. No trace. Town rumor said the younger one had finally done him in out of jealousy. Now the class was more interested. Ollie was listening closely. Soon after that, Mr. Easton went on, the younger brother disappeared. No one ever found traces of either of them. Eventually, the sheriff decided that the younger brother had killed the elder and then been overcome with remorse and thrown himself into the creek. That was when the rumors of hauntings started. Rustling in the corn, voices, footsteps without feet. They said the 2 brothers didn't lie quiet. Now the class was silent. In the pause, Ollie could hear the roar of rain on the school roof. She wished she knew how small spaces ended. The woman herself didn't live long after her husband vanished. Throughout her final illness, she swore that her husband wasn't dead, that he was still on the farm. Of course, they never found him. Legend says that now the woman haunts the farm too, looking for her lost husband and her brother-in-law. Eyeing the silent room, he added, You guys good on the ghost stories? Phil Greenblatt poked Brian and said, Be careful, the lady ghost might decide you're her murdered man. Brian snorted, and the strange tension broke. Can't imagine how your mother got hold of that story, Mr. Easton was saying to Coco. Bit of ancient history. I suppose she talked to Linda Webster. That's how Linda got the farm, you know. She's the great, however many times great-granddaughter of that poor young woman. Ollie stiffened. Jonathan Webster. John had said to Beth, This is my brother Caleb, my mother Kathy. Beth Webster. Linda Webster. Probably just a coincidence, though. A lot of people were named Webster. I'll pause for just a moment. Websters have owned that farm since the late 19th century, Mr. Easton added. The author just heard of Smoke Hollow and copied the names, thought Ollie. But sharp in her memory was a woman, her pale face makeup smeared, her eyes darting around the sunlit swimming hall, saying, I have to. Coco's hand was in the air again. That wasn't the weird thing, Coco said. You didn't tell the bad thing, the other thing, the schoolhouse fire. Yes, right, okay, said Mr. Easton. He addressed the whole class. The Websters have owned the farm since the late 19th century, but no Websters lived on the farm in the 20th century, except for once, briefly. I was a boy in Evansburg at the time. A man, his name was Garrett Webster, as I recall, moved onto the old property and tried to start a back-to-nature sort of school, basket making and things. It was he who renamed the farm Misty Valley. But one day, late in autumn, his schoolhouse caught fire. The class looked at one another. It was right after dark, one of those thick, ugly nights. The kids had stayed late to rehearse a play, I think. The ash bucket for the wood stove caught fire, the fire department decided later. No one made it out alive. I think there's a plaque somewhere on the farm with all the names of the kids that died. Garrett Webster moved away after that. Well, of course he did, devastated. They said he was quite successful, became a banker or something. But he never came back. No one came back until Linda Webster. But the weird thing, insisted Coco. You didn't say the weird thing. Yes, all right, Coco, Mr. Easton said patiently. The weird thing, as Miss Zintner puts it, is this. They never found any bodies. The schoolhouse was burned to rubble, of course, right down to the foundation stones. People came up from Rutland to pick through it, but nothing, no bones or teeth, nothing to bury, just stones and the nails that had held the building together. This didn't make any sense to Ollie. But, she burst out, to burn bone to ash, the fire would have to had burned at 1400 degrees at least for 2 hours or more. Ollie had done a lot of research about fires in the last year, trying to prove to herself that there had been a way, some possible way. There hadn't been, of course, but she was left with useless knowledge about fires. Mr. Easton looked pleased. Ollie had spent the last year determinedly silent in class, and here she was spouting random facts. You aren't the first one to point that out, Ollie, said Mr. Easton. There have been a lot of theories. Maybe the fire burned hotter than normal, leftover heating oil, some compound in the paint, tar. Those men from before, Ollie heard herself saying, the husband and brother-in-law, they disappeared too, or maybe the children just weren't there. Where would they have gone? Ollie heard herself say. Isn't that a lot of people to just disappear on one farm? I don't know, said Mr. Easton. That's why they call it an unsolved mystery. The county sheriff questioned Garrett Webster pretty well, of course. A big party searched the farm grounds, thinking perhaps the fire was to cover up a crime. At this, the whole class perked up. They didn't find anything, said Mr. Easton, suddenly brisk, seeing the eager faces. You gang of ghouls, because there was nothing to find. 5 years ago, Linda Webster rebuilt the old farm by the river, got it running, has been hugely successful. Now we're going there today, not to dwell on the past, but to learn more about the future of farming in this state. So can anyone tell me? Story time was over. Ollie wished class was over. There was something in all this she didn't understand. She wanted to keep reading.